Welcome, my fellow seekers. So in a previous video, I talked about 5 ways God shows himself in nature. And I want to focus today on the fine-tuning argument because even from atheists, it's considered the strongest argument, although they're obviously not convinced. And therefore, I'm also going to go through some of the objections to the fine-tuning arguments or explanations that they have. First, though, we have to define what is fine-tuning. It refers to the fact that constants and forces in the universe exist in an astronomically narrow range that permits for life. So, now let's get into some examples of this fine-tuning I speak of. There's about 140 examples that exist according to astronomer Hugh Ross, but we're only going to go into like 5 of them today. So first is the electromagnetic force. If the electromagnetic force were a bit stronger, atoms would hold onto their electrons so tightly that there would be no sharing of electrons and then no bonding of elements, so really just no chemistry. And then life couldn't exist. On the other hand, if it were a bit weaker, atoms would not hold on to electrons at all, once again making life impossible. There's also strong nuclear force. If it were weaker, only hydrogen atoms would exist. If stronger, then only heavy elements would exist. In either case, life couldn't exist because we're a mixture of both, and even in between. Hugh Ross explains, quote, "For life to be possible, it is critical that the strong nuclear force be attractive only over lengths no greater than 2 fermis and no less than 0.7 fermis, 1 fermi being a quadrillionth of a meter, and manifest the greatest attractive force at about 0.9 fermis. The reason is because protons and neutrons are made up of elementary particles called quarks and gluons, but that information is beyond the scope of this video. So let me just say that the important part is that if the nuclear force were not repulsive at 0.7 fermis, the quarks and gluons would merge so that there'd be no atoms, no molecules, or chemistry, making life completely impossible. There's also the weight of neutron and proton, so it's not just forces, but the weight of these particles. The neutron is 0.138% bigger than a proton, the neutron is. Because of this, they require more energy to make. Therefore, as the universe cooled from the Big Bang, it produced 70 times more neutrons than protons. However, quote, according to astronomer Hugh Ross, quote, "If the neutron were just another 0.1% more massive, so few neutrons would remain from the cooling off of the Big Bang that there would not be enough of them to make the nuclei of all the life-essential heavy elements. Now, that extra mass of the neutron determines the rate at which neutrons decay into protons and protons build into neutrons. Therefore, if the neutron were 0.1% less massive, so many protons would be built up to make the neutrons that all stars in the universe would have rapidly collapsed into neither neutron stars or black holes." And once again, those kinds of stars don't produce, and black holes obviously don't produce life, therefore life wouldn't be able to exist. Not only would the forces and weights of these things matter, but the number of them would. So there's also the number of electrons. Unless the number of electrons is equivalent to the number of protons to an accuracy of 1 part in 10 to the 37th power or better, electromagnetic forces in the universe would have overcome gravitational forces so that galaxies, stars, and planets would have never formed. And therefore life can't exist without a planet or a star or a galaxy, so life wouldn't be able to exist. But it's not just the number ratio of electrons and neutrons or things like that. It's also the forces work together as ratios of each. So let's look at the ratio of electromagnetic force and gravity. As Hugh Ross explains, if the electromagnetic force is relative to gravity were increased by just 1 part in 10 to the 40th power, the full range of small star sizes and types needed to make life would not form. So in all these cases, and plenty more I haven't mentioned, life could not form unless they were extremely precise, even to like 10 to the 40th power, which is extremely narrow range. So ultimately there are 3 explanations of this. 1, necessity. The universe had to come into existence with these properties. Second one is chance, and the most common idea about this would be the multiverse. And lastly, there's design. These are only three explanations. And so let's go through each one. First, there is necessity. The only problem, or there's really two big problems. One of the problems is that there's no evidence the universe had to exist in any way, shape, or form. It could have come into being in any way, and there's no really evidence that says it had to come in, let alone with these properties. Second of all, humanity is not a prerequisite for the universe's existence, So why would it need to come to existence for life specifically? So, for example, if gravity were a bit stronger, then the universe would have collapsed in on itself. So you might be able, I don't think this really holds up, but let's say, for argument's sake, that the universe couldn't come into existence that way because the universe couldn't even exist in that way. Well, if gravity were a bit weaker, things would have spread out so much life wouldn't have been able to exist. So why couldn't the universe come in that way? There's no evidence, especially because life is extremely astronomically narrow range in gravity. It's like 10 to a lot of power. But nonetheless, why did it have to come in there and not in another place? The universe would still exist, so why does it need to come in for life specifically? That doesn't really make sense. Let's go on to the next one, which is the multiverse. Primarily, this goes against Occam's razor. Occam's razor says, all things being equal, the simpler hypothesis is more likely to be true. But the multiverse posits nearly an infinite number of universes to explain how the ours became life permitting. It literally needs, almost infinite, is how scientists have put it. However, you look at design, it only posits one other entity, and that's a creator. So what's more likely? An literally near infinite amount, or two, I guess, the universe and God. So not only can we deduce that it had to be designed because the other two don't make sense, or are less likely, but there's also positive evidence, which is if it looks like design, we should probably just take that it probably is, because it looks like foresight, therefore it was probably foresight, and therefore was probably a mind. Therefore, design is the best hypothesis. However, it wouldn't be right to just go through the evidence for it. Let's go through some of the evidence against the design idea, or at least trying to explain it away without design. The first is the anthropic principle. This is when people say the universe has the properties it does simply because we're there to observe them. That doesn't really make sense because there is no causal relationship here. The fact that we can observe the universe did not cause it to be this way. And we're asking for the cause. Was the cause necessary? Was it just by chance? Or was there an actual causer or personal causer? If we were not here to observe it, the universe would still be the way it is. Let's say, even if we take an evolutionary and abiogenesis way of looking at it, let's say chemicals didn't make life. The universe would still be here. It doesn't really make sense. So I don't think that really follows. The second one, which is a bit stronger, is the puddle analogy. It says that that life is like a puddle that fits perfectly into a hole, and the water says it was perfectly designed for it. Or the hole was. So, that was an interesting one when I first heard it, and it took me a while, but the problem with this is that life is not like water in the sense that it can fit in any hole. Life is actually very picky, and not any hole or universe will do. As we have seen, and as scientists would pretty much all agree, life would not exist in all these other universes. That's why they posit the multiverse. The second part of this objection or explanation or whatever is actually one that was pretty strong for me, and I almost couldn't explain it, so I had to give it some deep thought, and that is, how do we know life wouldn't exist in a different universe with different properties? Because we can't actually observe that. And so I really thought about this, and I came up with two objections to this objection. One, in some cases, atoms and chemistry wouldn't exist, like with weak nuclear force. And so literally nothing would be able to exist, and therefore life wouldn't be able to exist. The second thing is that we can actually test the results of a different universe with different properties and see if life would result. And spoiler alert, it wouldn't. So for example, we can look at a property where there's only hydrogen atoms. So we can put hydrogen atoms together and see, would life come out? Well, no, it wouldn't. We can put something together with only heavy elements and be like, okay, does life come out? It wouldn't. So we can actually test to an extent and observe what would happen in these other properties or other universes with different properties, and, well, life wouldn't come out. Another rebuttal that I've heard, and this was also pretty strong for me, in my opinion, is that the universe is not fine-tuned for life, which is interesting because I think a lot of scientists would disagree with that, including atheists. But their argument is basically that if we look at the vast majority of the universe, life actually does not exist, and therefore it wasn't fine-tuned for life, or else life would be everywhere. There's a few things. One, this is actually evidence of a creator for life, because the fact that life doesn't come out naturally would suggest that something made it, but we'll put that on the back burner for now. What it does not explain is why the universe has properties that does allow for life. Even if it doesn't cause life, it does allow for it. In fact, there's over 100 or about 140 different properties that do, in fact, allow for life. And even if life can't arise on its own, the universe still has properties that allows for life once it does, is basically what I'm saying, and that must be explained. That's what we're trying to explain here, and that is pretty much undeniable. Therefore, I don't think any of these objections hold up, and so I'll just simply say a creator best explains the fine-tuning of the universe. I hope to see you next time. Please like and share and comment if you have any questions whatsoever, comments or questions, either one, and I'll see you all in the next one.